agency in the decision. And what I tend to say is they did not emigrate, they were emigrated. You know, it was something that was imposed on them. Incidentally, one of the ironies of the Cape Breton settlement was that the first wave of Hebridean settlers did quite well. Those who went out in the earlier era, they settled on fairly productive frontland farms. But those who followed them to Cape Breton in the famine era discovered that the good land was already taken, not least by fellow Highlanders and Hebrideans, but they also found Cape Breton was dogged by the same potato famine from which they had just fled. Irony there. Now, throughout the 1820s and 1830s, the crisis continued to deepen all around. In 1838, when the first potato famine was causing considerable distress here on the west coast and in the Hebrides, some Highlanders were able to emigrate to a new destination, Australia or New South Wales, by the extension to Scotland of a scheme of assisted emigration that had been applicable in England since 1832, didn't extend to Scotland, to say, until later in the decade. And that scheme used proceeds from the sale of Australian land to subsidise the passages of eligible emigrants. And your eligibility depended on your age and your occupation. So if you were a sheep farmer, then you automatically got a free passage because they were in great demand. Or if you were a domestic servant, you did as well. Now, about 5,200 Scots emigrated under that so-called bounty scheme by about 1840, and most of them were Highlanders. And according to a report, this is not Hebridean, it's mainland, according to a report in the Inverness Courier in 1838, thousands who gathered in Fort William to meet the recruitment agent were, according to the newspaper, anxious to quit the land of their forefathers and go and possess the unbounded pastures of Australia, unquote. And again, we're back into this, well, image and reality, expectations, experiences, did they jump or were they pushed? So that was it. There was a scheme to Australia in the late 1830s. There was another scheme that took Highlanders out to Australia in the 1850s during the big potato famine, the second potato famine. This was the Highland and Island Emigration Society, based really, most of the people who went came from Skye. That was where it was generated. And though the HIES sometimes quoted fulsome letters from apparently satisfied settlers to promote its cause. Now, if we take these kind of comments at face value, we would subscribe to the view that moving out did mean moving on, that emigration was equated with betterment rather than with banishment. But the dominant narrative doesn't tell that sort of story. The dominant narrative is a much more negative one of enforced, often brutal eviction and clearance. And that's why I've entitled that slide at the top, The High Noon of Exile, Famine, Eviction and Expatriation. The first half of the 19th century was a time when a number of traditional landlords went bankrupt and had to sell their estates, and the estates were either run by trustees or they were bought over by incomers who had no previous connection with the Highlands but were hard-nosed businessmen who were just concerned with profits and had no understanding of Highland traditions or Highland way of life. And I think the most notorious of those evictors, or those new landlords, was John Gordon of Cluny in Aberdeenshire, who bought in 1839 the Benbecula and South Uist from the bankrupt 18th Chief of Clanranald, and in 1841 purchased the secretary to the estate of McNeill of Barrow. Now, Gordon also owned plantations in the West Indies, so that's another story, 6 plantations in the West Indies. He was described as the richest commoner in Scotland, but I think he's perhaps best known in the Hebrides for being the most notorious evictor of his age. And I think he's also known in Canada in similar terms. His activities were evocatively documented by contemporary writers like Donald MacLeod and later on by Alexander Mackenzie, who described the mayhem during what they called the transporting season, as unwilling emigrants were pursued across the Maca by constables and handcuffed and dragged aboard the vessels that were anchored in Loch Boisdale. Nor did things improve at the other end, where the destitute Highlanders were dumped on the quayside at Quebec, even though for most of them the destination was a lot further west, several hundred miles further west in Upper Canada. So he was heavily criticised by Alexander Buchanan, the agent at Quebec who was charged with dealing with the new arrivals. But even in that unambiguously traumatic era of potato famine and forced emigration, there are paradoxes. Adam Hope, who's pictured at the bottom there, on the bottom right, Adam Hope was a Scottish businessman from East Lothian who'd emigrated to Upper Canada in 1834. And he was sceptical about the extent of the emigrants' poverty. And this is what he wrote in a letter to his brother back in Scotland in 1849. The Highlanders are not ashamed to let you know that they are paupers and to make themselves out poorer than they are. In changing some £1 Scotch banknotes in our stores, they let us understand they durst not allow their notes to be seen in Scotland, or they would not have got their passage paid. In less than 5 years, you will find that their Highland pride won't allow them to acknowledge that they got their passage paid, unquote. So that was Adam Hope's take on it. And so again, you're getting this sort of sense of ambiguity. But the dominant and enduring image was one of the emigrants as victims. Oops, I've got a bit ahead of myself there. I'm not quite ready for Killarney and Salford, so we'll go back to the Barra predictions. I finished with Barra, but I want to just mention Lewis briefly. Just as another example, in Lewis, 1,180 summonses of removal were issued between 1849 and 1851 alone, just in that snapshot period. And then, I am ready for the 1880s, in the 1880s, the image of exile was reinforced by many of the witnesses to the Napier Commission. For example, Reverend Angus McKeever of Uig reminded the commissioners of the blurred line between voluntary and enforced emigration. What he said of tenants in Uig was, of course, they were not taken in hand by the policeman, but he said these people were sent away very much against their will. He was really saying, many people were in arrears with their rent and they had their arms twisted to go. These people were sent away very much against their will. And that image of exile was further reinforced by reports of the experiences of the people who are pictured here. The 100 families from Lewis and Harris and North Uist, who, with government funding, a brief interlude of government funding, were relocated at Killarney and Saltcoats in Manitoba and the Northwest Territories, Canadian Prairies in other words, in 1888 and 1889. Now from a planning perspective, the venture was hastily conceived. It was also very, very poorly implemented. Applicants were given only a week between acceptance and embarkation to settle their affairs. And in one case where there were 2 replacement families allowed to, given permission to go, they were given 48 hours to settle up their affairs. 48 hours to end one life and start on a new one. Assurances from the Canadian end were vague, and the settlements will be set by huge practical and administrative and financial difficulties. And during an official visit to the infant Killarney colony in 1890, the Countess of Aberdeen declared, just by the way, Lord and Lady Aberdeen made an official visit there, and he's Lord Aberdeen's pictured on the right of the picture. Anyway, the Countess of Aberdeen, who took the photograph with her new Kodak camera, and again, that's another story, she declared, "May heaven preserve us from ever being fated to banishment to the far-famed wheatlands of Manitoba. Oh, the inexpressible dreariness of these everlasting prairies. The struggle to live has swallowed up all energy," unquote. Interestingly, Lady Aberdeen had a published diary and a private diary, and she said some things in the private diary that are much more revealing, and some of that is her fairly blunt comments about the prairies. But of course, for the Hebridean crofters out at Killarney and Saltcoats, there was the added challenge of being 1,500 miles from the sea in a landlocked environment. And that, of course, was a problem that also confronted those who went out in 1923 on the Metagama and the Marlock. And Andrew Lawler, the Killarney merchant who dealt with the settlers at Killarney, he claimed a few years later, observing them, he said their limited success was due to their monolingualism and their self-imposed isolation. They were so frightened of losing their culture by mixing with the other ethnic settlements on the prairies that they didn't learn the skills of prairie farming. This is a comment from him, and well, he says, you cannot grow wheat from garlic, and he added to that comment, they should have talked to their Russian neighbours down the road who had experience of prairie farming. So that's the Killarney settlement. And we'll, when we listen to Maureen Bennett a bit later on, pick up something that Andrew Lawler said in what she said, so there's continuities. Let's move on to the interwar era then. I promise you we are getting through it. We'll move the clock forward to the 20th century and to the story that will be very, very familiar to you, particularly this year. The 1920s, as you know, was the decade that unprecedentedly saw Scotland's population fall in absolute terms because the numbers leaving overtook Amsterdam in natural increase. Now, most of the emigrants in that decade were, as they had been from the 1860s, from the Central Belt. But probably a bigger impact was made on public awareness by the well-documented departures of the Marloch and the Metagama within a single week. And in fact, there was, it'll come back, I'm sure it'll come back, there was such an upsurge of Hebridean and Highland emigration to Canada in the early 1920s that a third Canadian government agency was opened in Inverness to add to the ones in Glasgow and Aberdeen. And that building's still there, well, yeah, you come out of the train station in Inverness and turn right down Academy Street, and on the corner of Queen Street and Academy Street, I think the bottom floor is now possibly William Hill's Bookmakers, but if you look up at that building, you can see that it still looks the same as it did. That picture was taken in 1929 when it was decorated for the visit of the Duke and Duchess of York, who were to become George VI and Queen Elizabeth and Queen Mother. Anyway, that office was opened, unusually with a woman agent, a woman federal recruitment agent. And I think it's perhaps the appointment of a woman was a surprise, but the fact that they opened this third office was also a surprise, given the long-standing Highland antagonism to emigration. And I think it gives us our first enigma of the interwar period, our first ambiguity. And I'll just go through these ambiguities very briefly, and the reason why I think things changed. In many ways, the state of the Hebrides in 1918 was similar to the state of the Hebrides 100 years earlier, or at the end of the Napoleonic Wars. There was an economic crisis, farming and fishing were in turmoil, there was the spectre of famine, there were special government investigations, there was financial assistance to emigrants, and there were active recruitment agents. So the wheel's going full circle. 100 years later, same sort of scenario. The new ingredient in the 20s appeared to be the islanders' apparently more positive attitude to emigration as a remedy. And I think if that was the case, the reaction was attributable to the interplay of three sets of circumstances, and I've bullet pointed them there: changing expectations, acceptable opportunities, and professional recruiters. So just very briefly, we'll go through those. But first of all, there was obviously despair and frustration. Some of the expectations were negative ones, and arguably emigration could be seen in the 20s as a last despairing resort or protest against the prospect of starvation, concern at alarmingly high rates of tuberculosis, and frustration at the tardiness of land settlement schemes. So that's why I put that commemorative cairn up. And then, of course, added to that, you have the tragic loss of the Isle Air that had cast such a deep gloom over the island of Lewis in particular, and helped to push people in the direction of making a new start away from haunting memories. But at the same time, there were positive incentives. The war had broadened the horizons of islanders, particularly ex-servicemen, who were able to compare the subsistence lifestyle back home with more comfortable conditions that they'd become aware of, or at least been told about elsewhere, and had begun to realise that some of their problems were simply the result of insurmountable physical limitations in their environment. And then, of course, you've got crafting legislation, and you've got the introduction of state pensions, particularly the state pensions beginning to offer a measure of security to elderly parents. So it became easier to untie the apron strings. It became easier for young people to go away and seek their living elsewhere. And that brings in the second positive expectation, which was the acceptable opportunities that opened up in the 1920s in the shape of what you see here, assisted emigration to the dominions, or at least 3 of the 4 dominions offered under the Empire Settlement Act. Now, unlike previous legislation, the Empire Settlement Act applied to the whole of the UK. It did not single out Highlanders as a special charity case like the Highland Land Emigration Society of the 1850s had done. Recruitment was under what was known as collective nomination, by which emigrants were given an advance of up to 75% of the £16 ocean fare. And the decision to have these big liners, the CP liners, call at the islands, was a deliberate one, partly to save the emigrants the expense of getting down to Glasgow. So that was the new opportunities that opened up in the 20s. As I was saying earlier, government was very reluctant to fund emigration. It was only in 1922 that Empire Settlement funding, up to £3 million a year for a 15-year period, came on the statute book, and it stayed on the statute book until 1972 with various changes of name. Now, the third ingredient was the particularly high-profile role of recruitment agents who first persuaded the emigrants to leave and then organised their departure. Agents were not particularly new, of course, with this type of recruitment. With their lantern lecture slides, their colourful posters and their pamphlets, competing agents had been a common sight in the Hebrides for many decades. In Lewis, in 1923, the key individual was the guy in the middle there, William Noxon, who was Agent General for Ontario, and he organised the Metagama's Hebridean passengers. And then, of course, there's the I'll go through these very quickly because everybody's seen them lots of times this year. Well, were their expectations of betterment fulfilled or not? The Metagama recruits had been offered a year's farm work in southern Ontario, and successful labourers were then told they'd be offered farms on uncolonised soldier settlement lands further north in Ontario, near Sudbury. But before long, the Canadian press began to vilify the new arrivals for taking up non-farming work, for defecting to the United States, and allegedly, if they stayed in Canada, breaking a strike in a Toronto brewery. For their part, some of the emigrants later claimed that they'd left farm work within a few weeks or a few months because of unpaid wages or low wages, poor living conditions, and unremitting work. Others went over to the US because of better job opportunities and higher wages, sometimes doing so obviously illegally, but they were getting jobs in the hydro schemes at Buffalo, the motor industry the new motor industries in Detroit. Others preferred to maintain their traditional links with the water by working on the Great Lakes rather than on farms. Now, if the story of the Metagama was controversial, the story of the Marlock is much more controversial. Noxon's counterpart in the south was this man, Andrew MacDonnell, a hugely contentious and enigmatic character. He was a product of the Abbey School at Fort Augustus. He'd worked as a mission priest in Glen Urquhart until 1912, and he then went over to Vancouver Island, to Ladysmith, to supervise the reception of orphan children from Britain. And again, that's a whole can of worms, isn't it? The story of child migration, again, which we haven't time to go into. But anyway, being at that sharp end of things, receiving these orphan children, gave him a taste, I think, for working as a recruitment agent. He was in the war, he won the Military Cross during the war in France, and then in the 1920s he got himself onto the roll of the Canadian immigration authorities, Canadian government, to recruit Hebridean Catholics for northern Alberta. And in selecting and organising recruits, he enlisted the help of fellow priests at home, and some of these priests he sent out on a kind of recce visit in the previous year. But the whole venture, both the Marlock, its famous one in 1923, and the other emigrants whom he sent out in succeeding years, the whole venture was really fraught with controversy. By the end of the decade, he transferred around 1,350 emigrants to Canada, to Alberta. Now, in 1955, MacDonnell received the MBE for his quote-unquote services to emigration. He died in 1960, and I found out last night he's buried in the graveyard at Fort Augustus. Didn't know that before. But his services to emigration would not have been recognised or admitted by many of his contemporaries. He aroused the ire of his recruits, he aroused the ire of the Catholic hierarchy in Scotland, the Canadian immigration authorities, and the British Labour Party. Back in 1995, I gave a talk about that in Benbecula, and I was told by somebody at that talk, if you had been giving this talk in South Uist, everybody would have clammed up, nobody would have said anything because they tried to pretend that he didn't exist. So much was he persona non grata in the Catholic community in the Southern Hebrides. Well, why was he so controversial? Now, by orchestrating the relocation of Catholic crofters, he was doing the bidding of Lady Emily. Whoops, sorry, just one or two pictures of the scheme. Yeah, the reason that they chose this place, Clandonald, was it was bisected by the Canadian Pacific Railway, and Lady Gordon Cathcart, who owned the islands from which these people were emigrating, had shareholding interests in the CPR. So there's a bit of a murky agenda there, which we need to, it's not actually been possible to unpack completely. But there's some pictures of the... anyway, there's the lady herself. Anyway, he was doing the bidding of Lady Emily Gordon Cathcart. Now, the Father Michael of Benbecula was at the talk last night, and he says, now, he says, don't overemphasize Lady Cathcart's anti-Catholicism, which I thought was part and parcel of why MacDonnell was unpopular. He said, no, she wasn't as bad as in her anti-Catholicism as her agent Ranald MacDonald. And he's pointed me to some sources that can demonstrate that. But one of the reasons that MacDonnell was controversial was he was doing the bidding of the estate, certainly the estate management, in encouraging Catholic crofters to go to Canada so that the crofts could then be given to Protestant tenants. And this man I was speaking to last night reckoned it was Ranald MacDonald was the holding the steering wheel on that one rather than Lady Cathcart. But anyway, the point remains that she did have shareholding interests in both the Hudson's Bay Company and the Canadian Pacific Railway, and certainly it was in her interest to see the lands alongside the track of the CPR populated, and these guys who were going out in the Marlock were populating those lands. Anyway, enough from me for just now. I want you to hear from Morag. This is Morag sailed on the Marlock, and I mentioned Morag to you at the beginning. As Morag MacLeod, she was 10 years old when she left Benbecula with her parents and 6 siblings. And she was in her 90s when I spoke to her in British Columbia about 15 years ago. She was emphatic that the reason her parents left was because there was no future in Benbecula for the family. And what follows is a compilation from the interview she gave me with reflections on the voyage, language, adjustment and hardships. And I think what she says brings out some of the ambiguities, or some of the disparities rather, between life in the islands, on board ship and on the prairies. And just a health warning before I start this, it might be a bit loud, so be prepared to cover your ears, and if it's too loud, I'll turn it down.
Oh, I remember the blasting of the fog barn, for sure, I can still hear it. And of course we were put in the staterooms, to sleep and that, and we never had running water in Benbecula, as you know, it was just a well, and we didn't know what the bowl and the taps and all this sort of things were,
Oops, I'm sorry, I thought I had the whole quote there, and I've only given you a short quote. I'll just mention the other bits that she said. She said, I was young, I thought it was great, especially the winter. I loved the snow, playing in the snow, but my parents, my mother brought a few plants from Benbecula. Of course, she didn't know that the winter was so cold, and they all froze the first frost. Then she said the houses were very small, they all had big families. That was the idea, to bring out the big families and get the prairies settled. The houses were just sort of square box, not insulated at all. Terrible. We had to cut the wood. and my father had to cut the poplar trees for wood to keep us warm. It was a terrible time. And then, remember I said she picked up something that Andrew Lawler had said, not that she heard Andrew Lawler, that Killarney merchant. She said, the Hebrideans didn't know how to farm properly. The Russian ones that had the good farms, they knew what they were doing. But from what I can think back on now, the Hebrideans didn't know. And that was very, very similar to what Andrew Lawler had said in the 1890s about, why didn't you talk to your neighbours down the road? Okay, let's move on to the final bit then, Hebridean emigration after the Second World War. We'll move on and think about how the Metagama shaped the decisions and the expectations of those who left in the 50s and 60s. But before we get on to the 50s and 60s, I want to begin with a family whose experiences straddle both eras. And these are the Murrays, the late siblings of Sharda here in Lewis, pictured when I interviewed them in 2005. Callum, his wife Jessie on the left, who didn't emigrate, and the sisters behind, Callum's sisters, Kathy in the red jumper, and Chrissy, who didn't emigrate. It was Kathy and Callum who emigrated, and the man in the middle is the family friend who introduced me to them. Anyway, when I asked them what they remembered about the departure of the Metagama, Callum responded that he just remembered faintly standing at the top of a hill with a lot of other people watching the ship head out of sight. Their demeanour was, he said, I'm quoting him, very sad, unquote. And his sister Kathy, behind him, added, they were sad, tears, because they thought they'd never come back. You see, in those days, you just didn't have money to burn. We're much closer to these places now. It's not a big, wide world anymore. Actually, that's a very prescient comment by Kathy, because one of the things that you're looking at changes in the course of the 20th century, globalisation, the world shrinking. Anyway, back to their own emigration story, which was largely a positive one. Before the First World War, their father, Callum, Kathy and Chrissy's father, had worked on grain elevators at Fort William, now Thunder Bay in northern Ontario. After war service in France and marriage back in Lewis, he re-emigrated in 1924, this time to Prince Rupert in British Columbia. And in 1927, he was joined there by his wife and the children. And they sailed from Glasgow on another CP liner, the Melita. Now, their father was killed in an industrial accident in 1932, and his widow found it too difficult to resettle in Calgary, where her sister lived. She didn't like the climate. So she brought the children back to Lewis, and they recalled back at school here being ridiculed for their Canadian accents and being made by the teacher to stand up and recite things, and then being laughed at by both the teacher and their fellow pupils. But the point I was wanting to make was that the wanderlust gene had been inherited, particularly by Callum, well, both of them really. Callum very much followed in his father's footsteps, because for 30 years, between 1953 and 1983, Callum was a transatlantic commuter. He spent his summers freighting grain on the Great Lakes, and he spent his winters back here in Lewis with his wife and family. The lakes froze up in the winter. And when he retired to Lewis, he would regularly meet up with others who'd had a similar experience on the Great Lakes, and they would reminisce. But Kathy, meanwhile, looked further afield. She went to New Zealand on a £10 passage in 1948, having heard about the scheme when she was working with the NAFI in Germany. And her enthusiasm for going to New Zealand came through very much in what she said in her verbal recollections. And I just wanted you to hear Kathy, because it sounds far better hearing her enthusiasm than me describing it.
So anyway, while I was over in Germany, I met a New Zealand girl. But meanwhile, I thought I was aiming for Canada all the time, and I wrote Canada House, got no answer. So this Betty, she says to me, you go to New Zealand, you see what they're doing there. So to cut a long story short, they answered right off, and all I had to do was fill the forms, and you could go over there for £10. And I was, of course, you had to work with them for 2 years, which was the best 10 years, £10 I ever seen.
Now, in fact, you could read that in a book there for £10, but you have to hear it. I mean, that was the enthusiasm, many decades on it. And she spent 2 years in Wellington, and then she went to Auckland, and she said she would have remained permanently if she hadn't had to come home to look after her elderly mother. Now, there's a subtext there, which I just looked at the time, so I haven't time to go into, but I can tell you a bit more if you like in questions. For the Murrays, emigration was very much of an adventure and a practicality. And also, ultimately, both Cathy and Callum came back to Lewis. Others didn't. And I want you to hear from one of them now. Of course, we have to be a bit cautious because those who were willing to actually put themselves forward for interview generally had a positive story to tell. They're a self-selecting group, and they're more likely to consist of people who've got a success story. But I want you to meet this chap. He's the late Murdo McIver. He was born in Arnall in January 1932, but he emigrated to Vancouver in 1953, initially, literally, by accident. He was in the Merchant Navy, but he had a back injury, which he'd suffered when he'd been working for Calmac earlier, and he was in hospital. And by the time he got out of hospital, after surgery, the ship had left. And he knew it was going to leave. He was quite happy to be left in Vancouver. And he tapped into an extensive network of people from Lewis to get his job. He ended up as chief fire master in the harbour in Vancouver. He was well prepared, though, for life overseas because of the global geography lessons he'd had in his home in Arnall from returning islanders as he was growing up. And I'll let Murdo tell the story himself because he tells it far better than I do.
It was a great place to grow up. Everybody knew one another. And our house was the centre of the village, and there was Kayleys there every night from Monday to Saturday. Never on a Sunday, as I would say. And I heard all the stories from Canada, Australia, South America, Falklands, South Africa, and a lot of the people that was there had gone back from Canada in the early 1930s because of the Depression. And some of them had gone back in the First World War and was gassed in France, so they didn't bother coming back to Canada. So the stories were fantastic. And I think that's maybe why I'm here today in Canada.
I interviewed Murdo 3 times, and I had the most amazing time each time I spoke to him. He was such a lovely, warm interviewee, and he'd have an amazing sort of genealogical knowledge as well. And first interview was on the phone, and number 2 and 3 were in person. And he was a bard. He just, I was very sad when I heard he passed away. And similarly, I had a great time when I met Norman here, Norman McRae, because another link between the 1920s and the post-war period was provided by Norman. Norman's father had emigrated from Lewis to Canada on the Metagama in 1923. He subsequently crossed the border to Detroit, where he met his Carloway-born wife at the Lewis Society of Detroit. But when Norman was 6, in 1947, his mother brought the 3 children back to Lewis so that she could nurse her husband's ailing parents at back. His father, meantime, like Callum Murray, carried on working on the Great Lakes, became a long-distance commuter, worked on the lakes in the summer, and came home to Lewis for the winter. 9 months away, 3 months at home. What Norman said to me was that when the family came back, it involved a drop in living standards. So we'll listen to Norman.
When we left the States, as many of the others who left these shores and went to the States, they had done reasonably well. We had a car, we had all modern conveniences. But when we came back to Lewis here, outside Stornoway there was no electricity, there was no running water, and of course the house we went to, it didn't have electricity, it didn't have an inside toilet even.
Okay, I'm going to just finish with the next interviewee, Annie McRitchie, who was Annie Matheson when she emigrated to Detroit. 5 years after Norman came to Lewis from the Hebridean hub of Detroit, 23-year-old Annie Matheson was preparing to go in the opposite direction. And her story is a familiar one, not unlike Murdo McIver's. When she was growing up in Col, she'd been fascinated by stories of the US from neighbours whose sons and daughters and siblings had gone overseas or across the Atlantic. And she contrasted her wages, her meagre wages in the Stornoway clothing store, with the apparently untold riches of the United States, where the perception was, she said, that earnings were 10 times as much as they were at home. And post-war blues in ration-blighted Britain reinforced her determination to spread her wings. This is what she said.
I never wanted to leave Lewis except I just had to go to America. I didn't want to go to Glasgow or London or I'd rather stay here and look at America was first. Oh, everything was better than I could ever imagine. I can't think of anything that was... I thought the American accent was so lovely.
But she didn't pick it up. She's been in Detroit since January 1953, but she didn't sound like it when I spoke to her. Affairs of the heart also played a part in Annie's decision because her husband-to-be, Norman McRitchie, had emigrated from Col a year earlier, and like many other Lewis men, he'd found a job on the Great Lakes. Norman's brother, meantime, Murdo McRitchie, had been called to the Free Church congregation in Livonia in Detroit. Now, although Annie had been dreading telling her parents about the decision that she was taking, she found they were quite accepting, and she said the whole community in Col followed her adventures with great interest. And she described her journey across the Atlantic. I've just realised the time, so I think I won't play this one because I don't want to keep you here all night. But she talked about the Queen Elizabeth, as she sailed on, being like a floating luxury hotel, which in the days of rationing it must have been. She said, all this fruit that you never saw at home. But she had a journey that took her from Lewis to Stornoway to Malib by boat, train to Glasgow, train to London, where she arrived in the middle of one of those pea soup smogs. And then she got the boat train to Southampton and boarded the Queen Elizabeth. And I've got another clip from her that I'm using for another purpose, where she said, when it was coming into New York, she said, under Brooklyn Bridge, all these bright lights and coloured cars. She said, we only ever saw black and grey cars. The cars were coloured. And she was so enthusiastic again. But I'm not going to deal with I'm not going to let her speak. I want to finish with Annie in about 1 minute. I was going to talk about remembering and forgetting, the sort of identity issues. But I'm sorry about the slide here. It's taken at Cape North, at the top end of Cape Breton. It was a very cold, windy day. It was a very prickly bush, and I let go of it at the wrong moment. But I'll tell you, if you can't see it, what it says. It's a gravestone to Roderick Mackenzie, a native of Parish of Locks, who did his training at New College, and then he went to work as a Presbyterian minister in Winslow, Quebec, Strathmore, Nova Scotia, and Cape North in Cape Breton. Now, the point about that is, he spent his entire career in Canada, but he ministered to Gaelic-speaking Hebridean congregations. So that was the way in which identity was maintained. And the church was a very important way in which my identity was maintained. And I thought I had another quote from Annie, but I don't. I haven't got it on a slide. But talking about retention of identity, Morag MacLeod, as a child emigrant, she was monolingual when she arrived in Alberta. Language was one clear identifier. Morag didn't want to retain her Gaelic because she wanted to be like everybody else when she went to school, although she would have been amongst other Gaelic-speaking Hebrideans in Clondalk. But she said in her 90s she still thought in Gaelic, because that was her first language. Murdo McIver, as an adult from the start, set great store by cultivating his Hebridean identity in the Pacific Northwest. His wife, who came from Harrickle, was another native speaker. They both maintained their Gaelic, and they were leading members of the Gaelic Society of Vancouver. And similarly, Annie, whom you've just met, and whom I'm sorry I had to cut off for reasons of time. For Annie, the Free Church of Scotland congregation in Livonia lay at the heart of her life from the start, and she set her identity and her life experiences, including her emigration, very much in the providence of God. And I think I'll finish with that because I see it's almost, it's after 8:10. So thank you.
Has anybody got any questions they would like to ask of the speaker?
I would like to read or hear it all again to reflect on so many of the aspects that you mentioned.
I don't want. I feel embarrassed about doing a commercial, but there is an audio book that I've done. It's not on Hebridean Emigration, but some of those people, all those people actually who appear, are in the book. It's called Testimonies of Transition: Voices from the Scottish Diaspora, and it's available as a conventional book, but it's also available as an audio book. It's actually quite difficult to get hold of because the publisher is not very good at marketing, shall we say. But you can actually, if you go online, you can get about 5 minutes of clips from people like Annie and is it Annie? No, I think it's one or two others. I've got 6 interviews in a very short YouTube clip that promotes the book. So just if you say YouTube and my name and something like Testimonies of Transition, you should get that YouTube clip. But I'm sorry, I didn't actually come here to try and promote what I write on, but that's probably the shorthand way of telling you how you can listen. I've got about a data bank of about 120 interviews, and it's been the most, I know it's been the most enjoyable part of my career has been talking to people and getting their stories and asking more questions, and sometimes exciting, sometimes very poignant. I was playing a clip last night in Benbecula of a lady who emigrated from North Uist to Australia in 1961 because, as a newlywed, her mother-in-law thought it would be a good idea for the newlyweds to emigrate. In other words, she had no agency in the decision. And the number of times the word homesickness comes out in her interview is very, very striking. And when I interviewed her, when I spoke to her, and she came back to North Uist, when I spoke to her in 2011 in her kitchen in North Uist, the anguish that she felt in the early 1960s was still very evident. And we were both sitting in her kitchen with tears streaming down our faces as she was telling me the story. And I mean, it's not that sort of thing that stays with you. It stays with you far more than reading. I mean, I enjoy reading documents. I love probing old documents. But speaking to people with real experiences is so rewarding. It can be very important.
Can I ask a question? Part of our exhibition, we covered that in 1906, 800 people left Lewis, most of the men to work on the Canadian Pacific Railway, which hadn't reached Vancouver by then. Now, they showed great courage and skill to go there. Also, about 5 years after that, men were going over to Canada and coming back, making a lot of money as lumberjacks. And there was no trees here. How did they learn how to become lumberjacks? Have you come across that?
They were the ones who did talk to their neighbours. they learned skills like cooperating with others, and it was survival, survive or perish. But it's interesting that you give that date of 1906 and then 1911. Because between 1896 and 1906, the Canadian government poured an unprecedented amount of money into the promotion of immigration to Canada, and they carpeted the British Isles with agents, and not least sending them out here. And it was reflected in a huge upsurge in employment. And in 1911, a man called Hugh McKerracher was a kind of supplementary, temporary agent sent by the Canadian federal government to lecture out here in Lewis. And I think it was Carloway, I can't remember, I can't be 100% sure of that. He went there with his exhibition wagon, and of course in the days before TV and radio that was a big thing, you know, somebody coming from a foreign country with a wagon that showed Canadian produce and stuffed wolves and all sorts of things. And I think the children were given a day off school, or I think the meeting was held in the school, and you know, it's got great publicity, and he described in his reports back to Ottawa, you know, the great enthusiasm of his audience. So yeah, agents I think had a big part to play in that surge just before the First World War. Because a lot of those who emigrated in that pre-First World War period then went and served in the war, and not all of them came back.
Yes, Ken?
You spoke about recruitment agents. I often wondered if the recruitment agents in Stornoway had different objectives from those down south in the Uists, because from Stornoway, passenger lists are filled with individuals, whereas from North Boisdale, they're filled with families, and it's the same era.
Absolutely, and again, another good question. It was because Andrew MacDonnell wanted to create a Catholic colony on the prairies in Alberta. That's why you've got that family composition of most of the people from there. It's pretty. I think it is striking in the passenger lists, and if you look at the huge volume of documentation that was generated at the Canadian end with that Clan Donald scheme, it comes out that that's what he was trying to do. And he was terrified in the later 20s and the early 30s. He was absolutely terrified that the communists were going to infiltrate his settlement, and he, you know, enlisted the help of fellow priests and lecturers at Francis Xavier University in Tignish, Nova Scotia, to come and, you know, give lectures in Canada to try and steer his colonists away from what he thought was going to be communism. He was scared of those influences.
Just a final one. I was on duty in our offices yesterday afternoon, and a lady came in and said, "Oh, that's Fort William. I'm from Fort William, well, now Thunder Bay." And she said, "Do you know, my husband was phoning me today saying it was 40 degrees, and she said it goes to -50 as well. I was just wondering, well, did these agents tell the people when they were going what sort of extremes of temperature?"
No, and that's again, good question, because it comes back to this issue of image and reality and expectation and experiences. And no, and I think some of the warnings, the cautionary tales were, you know, don't believe everything you hear. And the illustrator for the Canadian Pacific Railway in the 1890s was instructed by the CPR that he was not to show any snow on his illustrations. And he thought, this is absolutely ridiculous, because obviously you're going to get snow, particularly at the top of the Rockies. So what did he do? He painted the snow pink. And then you could argue, well, snow is white, so I've not been painting snow because it's pink, but of course it was the sun reflecting off the snow, so that was the way he got around it. And, you know, the CPR records, that's one of my, I need another lifetime thing. One of my next projects is looking at CPR records, because when I first started working, there was nothing, and they hadn't opened the archive. Now you can go and look at it in just east of Montreal, so I'm hoping to do that when I go out in October. And I would like to know about more about the recruitment and the conditions of those who worked on the railway. Whether I'll find anything out or not, I don't know, but I hope I do.
Well, there was a lady on our committee was out in Calgary this summer, and of course, who did she run to? Another Stornoway man.
Well, Murdo McIver, I mean, some of the stories he told me about, the first year he was in Vancouver, he said at the end of his first year, he went up to the interior, and he said, I met 14 people between Trail and Proctor. Now, that's about a 50-mile stretch of land. 14 people from Arnold. and I thought, yeah, that was really interesting. I mean, I had no reason to disbelieve it, but, you know, as historians, what we try and do is get corroborative evidence. And I hadn't been looking for corroborative evidence, but a few years ago I had a spare half hour, and I went in the library in Stornoway, and I thought, oh, I'll just look at the Stornoway Gazette for 1956. I chose 1956. And I opened it up, and here was Arnold District News, January 1956. It was the retirement of a captain, I think it was David McLeod, it was either Norman or David. He was a captain of the SS Moy, which was the last stern wheeler to ply Arrow, up and down Arrow Lake in the interior of BC. And it described how, the article described how people from Arnold had come from all over the province to be at his retirement presentation, including his own brother, who was captain of a steamer on another lake. And what was even more interesting to me was the SS Moy, when I went to Canada for the first time in 1987, is a heritage ship in Caslow in BC. And I visited it as a heritage ship, you know, looked at all the history and stuff of the area, not knowing that its last captain had been an emigrant from Arnold in Lewis. So I got the corroborative evidence from what Murder had said, and I also learned more about the SS Moy.
Yeah, I think you're right with David. It's a common name in Arnold, not throughout the rest of the island. Just one other thing, we've been mentioning merchant seamen. Vancouver, people who visited there, and they all ran into a man called Eddie Glennie, and they went to his house, which was called the Stornoway Embassy. So a lot of people know him for it. I would like to thank you all for coming along to this special summer edition, and thank you very much for coming along. We certainly enjoyed, well, imagine almost 300 years in an hour and a quarter. So, very well done, Marjory. Okay, thank you.